Global Affairs Unfiltered. I'm Jack Stockwell, and welcome to the K-Talk audience at, if I put that there, and I bring this all the way up, does this help the volume any? Again, I hear that we are on a very low volume. I don't know how to correct that at K-Talk Radio. I know how to correct it here on the stream, but I don't know how to correct it at the radio station, because they're going through some another round of changes and things that need to be altered as far as station equipment, location, all that kind of stuff is concerned. All right, it's Tuesday morning, the 3rd of June. You're listening to Global Affairs Unfiltered with Jack Stockwell and me. Several things I want to talk about, not the least of which is I've been praying all night long for Putin's patience. I'm sure that they have probably, in my worst fears, maybe 20 Oreshnik missiles that have now been uncovered and ready to be fired. And remember one thing about the Oreshnik, even though it is not nuclear, because of the tremendous kinetic force that occurs, at impact point, just as with a nuclear explosion, at impact point of the Oreshnik warhead, temperatures exceed the surface of the sun. And very interesting device, to say the least. Now, as you are listening to me right now, the financial forces that are associated with the City of London and Wall Street are careening the world to an appointment with thermonuclear hell. And it's not only sane, but essential to ask this question here on the 3rd day of June. Has the world, with the June 1 attacks by Ukraine on 4 Russian airfields, including the destruction of nuclear-capable aircraft that are part of Russia's thermonuclear triad, have they crossed a line beyond which there lies the immediacy of the species annihilating thermonuclear warfare? During the entire Cuban Missile Crisis of 1962, nothing so dangerous as to what's happened the last 3 days has ever occurred. So on the eve of the June 2nd Istanbul talks, the June 1st Sunday's destruction of at least 9, maybe more, the Ukrainians are claiming 40, but the Russians have said it looks like it's about 9, Russian military aircraft at bases in various parts of Russia. This is part of the insidious aspect of this, is it wasn't just on the far western border of Russia, the eastern border of Ukraine, but the interior of Russia. And these Russian bases in Murmansk, in Ryazan, in Irkutsk, in Ivanovo could not have been carried out, various analysts contend, because I've been reading it all morning, without the supervision of NATO and the involvement of either Britain, the United States, or both. Now, the former UN weapons inspector, Scott Ritter, of whom many of you are very familiar, puts it this way. He said this would be, and I said this yesterday, I'm going to repeat it again. He said this would be the equivalent of a hostile actor launching drone strikes against U.S. Air Force B-52H bombers stationed in Minot Air Force Base in North Dakota, at Barksdale Air Force Base in Louisiana, and B-2 bombers stationed at Whiteman Air Force Base in Missouri. Now, just consider for a moment, what would the United States do if in a military border dispute with Mexico, that nation, using Russian and Chinese-made weapons, using their satellite, their surveillance, their guidance systems, and even in-person trainers on the field, on the ground in Mexico, blew up just one plane at an American Air Force base using drones across the border? what would the American response to that be? And there's an even larger, more terrifying consideration. The Sunday attack on June 1st, somewhat reminiscent of a 9/11 type surprise. The coordination, the complexity also begs the question as to whether President Donald Trump did or did not know this attack was in the works. And in the case that he didn't know, we could be witnessing the beginning of a coup against Trump by those who set this attack up. Former UN or U.S. National Security Advisor Michael Flynn said this: "It appears Zelensky gave the go-ahead to attack parked Russian nuclear-capable bombers without informing President Trump." Now, if true that our president was not consulted nor informed, this isn't simply a breach of protocol. This is a geopolitical insult, but even more than that, it's a very big warning sign against Trump. Now, alternatively, if Trump did know about the attack and he authorized it, then that would mean he has given up on the diplomatic relationship between Putin and Russia. And the inevitable conclusion to this that I've struggled with all night is that world war is now imminent. I mean, in either case, we are heading for war, and we are heading for war fast. And that means in any case, you need to mobilize yourself. You need to mobilize your family. You need to mobilize your neighbors to rise up and declare independence from this incredible war insanity and reverse the course by acting like free citizens in this republic in the midst of absolute world history making taking place right now that they will be reading about for decades to come, if there's anyone left to read. We also have to rise up and stop the deployment of Germany's Taurus missiles to the Ukraine. If, as some journalists believe, and I was talking about this yesterday, the Taurus missile is already in the Ukraine, then German government has to take them out and withdraw them immediately with public attention to doing so. Remember, Russia, which lost 27 million people in the Great Patriotic War, the Second World War, and battles against Germany, would be prepared, as they have already alluded to destroy the production facilities in the cities of Germany which made the Taurus missile. And I think only a new security and developmental architecture, which China's President Xi Jinping is calling a win-win dedication to the benefit of the other, can forge some narrow pathway forward away from this increasingly species-destroying threat of international thermonuclear war. Now, if we do nothing, then the morons of American foreign policy will be taking over, as they're desperately trying to do. And the two psychotic clown leaders of this charade, being carried out by Senators Lindsey Graham and Richard Blumenthal right now in Ukraine, is undermining any prospect for peace. You have two duly elected U.S. senators in Ukraine doing everything they can to keep the slaughter of Ukrainian men and women going. And at the heart of their push right now is this bipartisan sanctions bill backed by nearly the entire U.S. Senate, but still facing certain odds in Washington. And it would impose 500% tariffs on countries that continue to buy Russian oil, Russian gas, Russian uranium, other strategic minerals, targeting nations, of course, like China and India, that account for roughly 70% of Russia's energy exports, and bankrolling much of its war effort. That's Politico. Lindsey Graham, who occasionally says something out of his mouth that actually impresses me said that this bill before the Senate is the most draconian bill he's ever seen in his entire life in the Senate. Now remember, this is the same Senate that, or Congress for that matter, that just a year ago lined up to kiss Netanyahu's ass in front of everybody. So not only are they genocidalists, they are warmongers, eager to do whatever is necessary to satisfy their number one contributors to their re-election campaigns, not the least of which is the military-industrial complex. Now, in this age of thermonuclear weapons, war as a means of conflict resolution, which is pretty well a good descriptor of U.S. foreign policy, is just suicidal madness. The global majority, the nations of Africa, Asia, Ibero-America, want peace through economic development. Civilization is not going to survive if it is fought. Yet there are many in the City of London and Wall Street in the Billionaires Club that desire perpetual war. They have to be stopped. And the first thing to do is not to act, but to think, which I'm sure is what Putin is doing right now. And what can you best contribute to reverse this direction as a citizen of the United States? Constant contact with your duly elected representatives in the Senate and in the House, through emails, through phone calls, whatever. Don't stop. Now, at the same time, there is this constant push by American billionaires as well as European billionaires for this war to continue because they just make tons of money off of it. And not only do they make tons of money, they get greater control of the governments that are involved. The role of money and the role of financing in international war is no different now than it was in the 1600s in Europe, and the power that the bankers had back then to control governments. Same thing that's going on today. It's just things can happen much faster, and that's the scary thing. Because of the internet, information flows much faster, leaks come out much faster, whistleblowers blow their whistles much louder, and the chance for a strategic mistake to be made increases proportionally. Now, there are interventions, standing up in public and denouncing those that are perpetuating war in high places. There's the street presence, talking to people face to face, making sure they're not overlooked. There's the appeal of Pope Leo XIV now, the first American pope in history, whose first words upon taking his position as he walked out there onto the portico, "Peace be unto all of you." And there is circulating, studying, working the Oasis plan for Gaza to the United Nations prior to the special session on Palestine that's coming up. There is stopping the Blumenthal-Graham sanctions bill from passing in Congress. That could still be stopped yet. There's the building of the International Peace Coalition, which is a worldwide organization. We just might likely be among the last generations of the human race that looked into the mirror and collectively did not find ourselves morally fit to survive. All right, there's something playing at K-Talk, so I'm going to continue talking to my streamers. Now, the Russia...
RUP Laboratories in Salt Lake City has multiple positions. You are listening to K-Talk Media, KBJA, AM 1640.
That's weird.
Sandy, Salt Lake, and the entire Wasatch Front.
That's weird. Sorry about that. So the Russia-Ukraine talks in Istanbul. There was a lot of talk out on the street that as soon as the Russian delegation in Istanbul for the Ukrainian talks, As soon as they heard about their 9/11 attack on their 4 air bases, packed up their stuff, left the table, flipped them off with the middle finger, and disappeared. From what I've been able to ascertain so far, that's not true at all. Not true for 1 minute. The talks went on. They lasted more than an hour, were conducted by the Russians, and both sides presented their proposal for the peaceful resolution of the conflict and discussed these in some length. Now, the parties discussed 2 proposals and are determined to hold a 3rd round, time and place yet to be determined. But the Ukrainian side proposed that they meet again between June 20 and June 30. Arrangements were agreed for prisoner swaps, for the return of dead bodies, and the ongoing emergency care for the wounded. The meeting started an hour and a half late, as Umarov, the head of the Ukrainian delegation, had asked for a private meeting with the Turkish foreign minister, who was moderating the event. And it's also reported that members of the Ukrainian delegation met in advance of the meeting with representatives of Britain and Germany and of Italy. So the Russia-Ukraine talks took place in the context of the Ukrainian attacks on the Russian strategic military facilities and the sabotage also, I forgot to mention, the 2 railroad lines, leading to the deaths of many passengers. And surprising on one level, however, the sources close to the diplomatic process indicate that these facts will not directly affect the negotiations. That is coming from Russian news. The negotiations will continue even with these horrendous acts committed against Russia. And then as I was listening to the news this morning, putting my notes together, they're still talking about how what the West did in attacking these military bases was in return for all of the Ukrainian citizens that have been killed all over the Ukraine by massive drone attacks by Russia. But what they don't mention, after they say that silliness, is that what Russia did was in return for what the Ukrainians did in trying to kill Putin, with a massive drone attack in Kursk when Putin was in his helicopter. Now, there's word that the helicopter was hit, but not seriously, and that Putin is okay. If Putin had been killed when this happened the other day, I wouldn't be here right now doing this radio show, because there wouldn't be any electricity. There wouldn't be any internet. We would be in full-scale war with Russia had the planned assassination of Putin actually occurred. Now, just like Trump, Putin has been able to ward off many assassination attempts that don't make it to the public media. I read somewhere one time, I don't know how authoritative it is, but indicated that there have been at least 40 assassination attempts on Trump. But I think you're going to see, and I hope I'm correct, less and less assassination attempts against Trump, because Trump is finally doing what the deep state wants. The deep state wants the elimination of the Palestinian population, so Trump is doing his best to aid that genocide. And they want to see the continuation of the war in the Ukraine. And they're at a point now where there are hardly any young men left as cannon fodder of the Ukrainian species. And so the German delegation in Poland, not delegation, contingent or division, the German of the Bundeswehr, that is currently, I think, a 5,000-man force that I think is currently in Poland on the Ukrainian border. Starmer has just called up asking for a draft in England. France has a lot of fighting forces ready and may already be on the ground in the Ukraine. And so this is the object of our government and our billionaires to keep this thing going. And so it's very surprising, on, as I said, on one level, that the people who are close to these diplomatic processes indicate that what happened in this attack won't affect the negotiations. And the Russian Ministry of Defense is going to be responsible for response to those strikes. And so diplomats are doing what they can to try to save human lives and end the conflict at meetings of these delegations. Now, the Ukrainian side presented its proposal in these peace negotiations the other day in Istanbul. Number one, there should be an immediate ceasefire. Number two, Ukraine rejects neutrality and wants the right to join any alliance it wants. Number three, non-recognition of Russia's new districts. No reduction in their military force on the ground in the Ukraine. And the right to deploy the forces of any other country on its territory, which I don't know how they can sit there with a straight face and say these things in front of the Russian delegation, because these are absolutely unacceptable to the Russian side. So then the Russians presented their proposal for peace, and the Turkish side stated simply that the meeting had ended not negatively. Well, it didn't end positively, but at least it didn't end at least it ended not negatively. Now, Russia's chief negotiator, Vladimir Medinsky, indicated that they had again agreed on an exchange of the wounded and the sick prisoners in an all-for-all format that could include as many as 1,000 soldiers on each side. And this would include, of course, exchanging those prisoners under the age of 25. And Medinsky also announced plans for the creation of a medical commission that would be responsible for the exchange of the severely wounded without need for political discussion. And in addition, he proposed a temporary ceasefire for 2 to 3 days at certain sections of the front in order to collect the bodies of the fallen. And the two sides have agreed to an exchange of the bodies of fallen soldiers. Now, the Ukrainians presented a list of children that had been taken by the Russian forces during the course of the conflict, which they wanted to be returned. Medinsky said that the Russian side would look at the list presented. Now, of course, the Western side of the story is that Putin kidnapped these children. The Russian side and the ethnic Russians in Ukraine said, no, we sent our kids out of here so they wouldn't continue to be killed by the constant ongoing onslaught against us by the Ukrainian forces. Now, I said here at the beginning of some part of my opening statement was the idea that if Trump did not know of this attack by the Western forces against these Russian air bases, I don't know how I can come away with any other conclusion than the coup is on for the removal of Trump. And then I said, Trump keeps throwing out these curveballs where one day he's for peace, the next day he is to let things continue. One moment he has great respect for Putin. Putin's a great negotiator, and then out of the other side of his mouth, Putin is crazy, stupid, doesn't know what he's doing. I mean, it reminds me of Biden. Now, retired General Michael Flynn posed, I think yesterday on X, a very critical question as to the implications of the attack on the Russian strategic bombers being done with the knowledge or consent of U.S. President Trump. Other voices started showing up overnight on this same issue. But so far, the White House is silent. And when asked yesterday afternoon what Trump's reaction to the attack was, the press secretary Leavitt said this, quote, "The reaction is this war needs to come to an end, and this war has been brutal from both sides, and the president wants this war to end at the negotiating table." Well, Flynn said in his part on his X post yesterday, and if you are an X user and you follow people on X, because this program is on X as well as YouTube, you might want to follow General Flynn, retired General Flynn, because he usually has some insight as former national security advisor under Trump 45. But Flynn said this, "So it appears Zelensky gave the go-ahead to attack the parked Russian nuclear-capable bombers without informing Donald Trump. Now, if true that our president was not consulted nor informed, this isn't simply a breach of protocol. I think it's a geopolitical insult and a warning sign, as I said earlier. If Ukraine is willing to conduct strikes with strategic consequences without notifying the White House, we are no longer allies with the coordinating issues. We're just co-belligerents flying blind." Is this the work of the coalition of the willing? As France, the United Kingdom, Germany, and Poland come together, realizing that help from America is going to be dwindling, and they're going to need to step up to the bar and do something themselves. Did they do this without Trump's knowledge? Now, Flynn singled out the activities of U.S. Senators Graham and Blumenthal, who were in Kyiv last week. I don't know if that's sedition. I mean, I'm all for talks. And I'm all for halting the bloodshed. And I'm all for staving off a coming war that could mean the death of my grandsons. But when you go over there and you say the kinds of things that Graham was saying and Blumenthal was saying, it's not some investigative group on the part of two senators who have tremendous amounts of money in their coffers from the military-industrial complex. It's something more insidious than that. So Graham and Blumenthal were there just before the attack happened, which could make the attack appear as though it was sanctioned by the U.S. And I certainly hope and pray, as does General Flynn, that the Russians have better intelligence than that. I mean, people, especially world leaders, need to realize the global implications to such an operation as Ukraine just pulled off, because Russia will respond. And as we have seen to date, with a lot of different attacks against Russia, like 2 years ago with the first flying of drones into apartment buildings in Moscow, most of which get shot down. And who knows how many drones were involved in this launch that did get shot down. But enough got through to damage or destroy 9 of their strategic bombers. These things aren't cheap, any cheaper than our strategic bombers. But Russia is going to respond. This is probably the worst attack. They may all be responding right now. I don't have immediate update information. But I would think before this week is out, certainly before next week is over, there will be hell unleashed on the Ukraine. And Putin may go so far this time for serious, deep attacks inside of Kyiv in known defense areas, no, because the Ukrainians tried to attack the Kremlin with their drones. Nothing successful, but they tried. And this is where, again, my prayers, and I am a praying man, Praying, for Putin's continued patience. But there will be a response. And maybe it's time to pull out an Oreshnik or two. And maybe time to, with warning ahead of time, because they warned the last time they used the Oreshnik against the, I don't remember if it was Rhine metal or not, but that area in the oblast, was it, I can't remember if it was Lugansk or not, but it was a center where they were building armaments for the Ukrainian army. An area now have been taken over by the Russians. But when they set that Oreshnik in there, the devastation with one Oreshnik was just way beyond anything they had expected. Well, what if they were to drop an Oreshnik on the government buildings in downtown Kyiv, right there on the edge of the river? Now, when they did it 2 years ago, they gave a warning. Or it may have been as recently as just a year ago, I don't remember. They gave a warning ahead of time. Hell is on its way. Would they give a warning this time, unlike what the Ukrainians did against the Russian bases? And how many Russian military were killed in these attacks? And again, it's deep inside of Russia. It's not some border skirmish. So there's three others who are making related points yesterday in the news besides General Flynn. Rogan O'Handley of the DC Drano, just like it sounds, DC Drano X accounts, interesting to follow. He said there are American fighting forces embedded within Ukraine, and they're helping gather intelligence and coordinate attacks. The latest attack just took out 1/3 of Russia's nuclear-capable bombers that America said we wouldn't attack in a previously agreed nuclear treaty. So who do you think Russia is going to point their finger at? Not just Zelensky or NATO, it will be America. And this attack was intentionally conducted to drag America into World War III because Zelensky knows once this war ends, he's going to be booted out of office, and probably worse. How much can be said in just a few sentences? It's the same thing with Netanyahu. Netanyahu's got to keep this war going or he's going to end up in prison. And the only thing that's stopped the judicial effort right now to put he and his wife behind bars the rest of their life for their fraud is the continuation of this war in Gaza. Well, Zelensky knows the same thing. All right, Dan Caldwell, who is a former top Pentagon official who advocates for America First foreign policy, warned that this operation, quote, raises risk of direct confrontation between Russia and NATO. U.S. should not only distance itself from this attack, but end any support that could directly or indirectly enable attacks against Russian strategic nuclear forces. Charlie Kirk, described as a leading MAGA activist listened to by the White House, said the strategic consequences of strikes deep within Russia seems very much on the interior of Russia. I sure hope America had nothing to do with this. Because remember what Putin has said a number of times. When we can positively identify who was involved with what in their attack against Russia, we don't care if it's Ukraine or some other country. It makes them a target. And as Lavrov has said on more than one occasion, you don't think we know where Washington, D.C. is? And Medvedev has gone even further than that. Medvedev, in that, do you know what lies off the coast, the eastern seaboard of America? Yeah, these Poseidon torpedoes. These Poseidon torpedoes that are nuclear powered. These things are immense in their length. And they have a nuclear power. And they rumored to have a nuclear warhead. And these things can run hundreds of miles because of the fuel that's inside these things. And they can go almost undetected right up the Potomac and sit there right next to the Jefferson Memorial before they explode. Now, Putin didn't say that. Lavrov didn't say that, but Medvedev said that, who I think is Putin's spokepiece to a certain degree when the obvious needs to be said, but Putin doesn't want a finger pointed at him. Now, I would like to say everybody is backing down from the table, waiting with bated breath as to what is going to happen in Russia's response to this attack. But no, the Brits are moving forward. British Prime Minister Keir Starmer announced the release of his government's strategic defense review during a speech at the Govan shipyard in Scotland. And it was yesterday. And he said this: "The strategic defense review that I'm launching today will bring the unity of purpose to the whole of the United Kingdom to mobilize the nation in a common cause, recognizing in these dangerous times that when it comes to the defense of the realm and the defense of everything we hold dear, nothing works unless we all work together." Then he made clear that the strategic defense that he was proposing isn't just a defense policy. He said that it was meant to militarize the entire country to oppose the alleged Russian threat. Starmer promised the United Kingdom defense spending will hit 2.5% of GDP by 2027, with the ambition of hitting 3% in the next parliament. He said subject to economic and physical conditions. And he added that his government will make 3 changes in defense policy. First, we are moving to war-fighting readiness as the central purpose of our armed forces. Now, traditionally, you know, it's like during World War II when the Department of War was changed to the Department of Defense. The Secretary of War became the Secretary of Defense. We're not in war anymore, but we want to have a good defensive military stance. So we're going to change the name of that particular dynamic to the Department of Defense, the DoD, centered in the Pentagon. And the other nations of Europe did the same thing, where instead of being on war footing, they went to defensive positions, especially with the emergence of the Warsaw Pact nations and the oncoming Cold War and the constant threat of Soviet annihilation of the Western European nations by the Soviet missiles. And so they were all defensive. Now, what just happened yesterday with the Prime Minister of England saying, we are going to move to a war-fighting readiness as the central purpose of our armed forces, when we are being directly threatened by states with advanced military forces? The most effective way to deter them is to be ready and, frankly, to show them that we're ready to deliver peace through strength. Secondly, he said, everything we do will add to the strength of NATO, because NATO is a fundamental source of our strategic strength. Thirdly, we will innovate and accelerate innovation to a wartime pace so we can meet the threats of today and tomorrow. Now, if you were Putin, how would you interpret that statement? Now, let me take that back. That's a silly question. Because the Russian Defense Ministry and the Russian war councils already know what's up. And they have another 750,000 well-trained fighting men and women on the border ready to come in and clean out the rest of the crap at a military strength that they have yet to represent. Don't be fooled. Don't be fooled by what happened in April of 2022 when Putin moved in a force of less than 200,000, only, excuse me, only to demonstrate the seriousness of their intention of stopping the slaughter of ethnic Russians in eastern Ukraine. And when he showed up and the Ukrainians backed down, said, okay, then he turned his forces around right there on the outskirts of Kyiv, turned his forces around and had them come back to Russia. And when they had turned their backs and were leaving, then the Ukrainian army attacked them. And they dealt them a heavy blow because they weren't in a defensive posture. They thought they made their point and they were leaving. Putin, commenting on that later on, said, had I known that was going to happen, that first invasion would have been quite a bit different. Now he's been holding back with this second invasion force. And he doesn't necessarily have to respond to this 9/11 attack against Russia this weekend with the Oreshnik missile and further provoking nuclear war. He can just finally move in that 750,000 fighting force and go to the Dnieper and take Kharkiv and take Sumy and take Odessa and take everything up to the Dnieper River and then mount his last attack to Kyiv. Now, he doesn't want the Ukraine. He doesn't want the Ukraine any more than you want Mexico. He just wants the shelling of the Russian ethnic population to stop. So what's going to happen? I'm kind of glued to my internet sources and glued to the news on TV, even though what you're getting on television is just total propaganda BS. You have to go to the alternate news sources. And I go through a lot of them before I sit down and say what I want to say. But Starmer made it clear that this new strategic defense initiative that he is calling the United Kingdom together to do, which will include a draft, mind you, isn't just a defense policy, although that's what he's talking about. He says, when it comes to the defense of the realm and in defense of everything we hold dear, nothing works unless we work together. It's not a defense policy. It's a militarization policy to militarize the entire United Kingdom to oppose this alleged Russian threat. And then Starmer promised that the UK defense spending will be 2.5% of GDP by next summer, and then the summer after that maybe hit 3%. And he added that his government is going to make 3 changes. He said, first, we're moving to war-fighting readiness as the central purpose of our armed forces. What does that mean? We are moving to war-ready readiness as a part of our armed forces, the purpose, the central purpose of our armed forces. And then he said, when we're being directly threatened by states with advanced military forces, the most effective way to deter them is to be ready, to show them we're ready to deliver peace through strength. Well, I need to make a correction on something I said yesterday about the Taurus missile. There are those who say that the German Taurus cruise missile is capable of carrying nuclear warheads. And I said that because I thought that at the time, but I looked into this further. The Taurus missile is not known to be nuclear capable, and Germany is not a nuclear-armed state outside the presence of the U.S. B-61 nuclear bombs that are in Germany as a part of NATO's nuclear sharing program, remaining under the control of the United States, even though they're in Germany. Now, that was pointed out to me yesterday. Jack, you might want to look into that a little further, because you said this Taurus missile is nuclear capable and may already be nuclear armed. Well, as I often do, I said that without thinking, because Germany is not a nuclear state, even though they have nuclear power plants all over the place. And they do not have nuclear weapons except for the American B-61 nuclear bombs that are in a few places in Germany under the control of the United States. So, as a part of NATO's sharing policies. So I need to take that back because what I said there was incorrect. All right, I've got a lot more things to talk about. I want to mention the South African press is reporting on the Schiller Institute, interestingly enough, and what they had to say against German missiles for an anti-Russian war. And I thought that, I'm not going to take the time to go into it, I just thought that was really interesting that happened. Now, I think the commander of the Ukraine ground forces just resigned this weekend, Sunday. So even as Zelensky's regime and its British U.S. enablers crowed about the Operation Spiderweb as proof that Ukraine is able to continue its war against Russia until Europe has sufficiently rearmed itself to join the war, the commander of Ukraine's ground forces, Major General Mikhailo Doprate, announced his resignation, and the ostensible reason he cited was that 12 service members had been killed, 60 others wounded the same morning when a Russian missile struck the 239th Polygon training ground north of the city Dnipro. Now, is that the sole reason he resigned? I mean, is the Ukrainian military beginning to crumble? That's what a lot of people think, because when the general major of the Ukrainian forces takes personal command of the Eastern Front last January by assuming the command of the military's Koryetsia, the operational strategic group, it was viewed by some military analysts then as a sign that the armed forces of Ukraine was getting its act together, at least on one important segment of the front line. I'm going to get into more on this. I want to get into some more comments, especially Gilbert Doctorow's comments. And the British military finally admitting that there are Nazis in the Ukrainian ranks of their military. I think that's pretty interesting. So, just a catch up here really quick with what I am Father's Day is coming up here pretty quick. And I have a pack for Father's Day that is designed at underscoring Dad's emotional health, endocrine health, and sexual health, in that there is an increasing number of guys at younger and younger ages who are far more interested in their video games and sitting around doing nothing than what was once a primary behavior of that same age group 50 years ago. And it's something called low T, low testosterone, and it's not just the ill effects on our sexual behavior as men when we have low T. We have low brain facility, low brain function. Your heart starts to weaken. Your muscles start to weaken. Your ligaments start to weaken. You have less and less drive to do anything, let alone sex. So I put together this Father's Day pack. It includes something called Simplex M, which is the protomorphogens to trigger the rebuilding of new healthy tissue. It includes Tongkat Ali, which is this herbal testosterone support supplement from the Orient. It's been known for hundreds of years, known as Malaysian ginseng, also known as long jack. And this specific extract that I'm using has been studied extensively in clinical trials. And it's a traditional tonic to promote healthy sexual interest as well as vitality. And then also wheat germ oil, a special handling of wheat germ oil that has the precursors of sex hormones in this vitamin E complex. And it's just 3 things. I think it would make a great Father's Day gift without being too obvious. Just tell them, hey, it's to turn your brain back on, get rid of that brain fog, put some zip back into your heart, get your heart beating a little faster, get your muscles to tighten up, get you back out there in the yard, or get you back out on the golf course, or get you back up in the mountains, or whatever else. You don't have to talk about sexual inadequacy. They will find that change by itself. And that is the Jack's Pack for Men's Health. And it's available now at a nice discount. If you bought all these products separately, it would cost more, but in the pack, it costs less. And then I got some things to tell you right after the top of the hour regarding what's happened recently with the seizures, with severe spinal pain, with severe sciatica, the things that are happening structurally in the clinic. We're going to go to break here in a few moments at the radio station, which has already begun. But I want to talk to those of you who are listening on the stream, because I haven't figured out a way yet to be able to play something during the news break so that I can have a break, get up and walk around for a second or whatever. But I'm glad to see the numbers listening on the stream increasing. And whatever you can do to share or recommend or get notification when they're coming. I have my green screen now. I just haven't turned it on, haven't put it up. I'm going to change the location of where I'm doing these shows so I can do a much better program. And I'm going to do a series of much shorter broadcast isn't the right word, podcast maybe, shorter YouTube videos of a political, geopolitical nature, especially as we're barreling now on towards thermonuclear war, depending heavily on the patience of Putin and what he plans on doing next, because the West simply refuses to recognize the fact that the war is over, that they lost. Now, the Ukraine drone strikes on Russia continue after the strikes on the airfields, interestingly enough. In its morning update this morning, the Two Majors Telegram channel, Two Majors, a military update source, reported that the Ukrainian drone campaign, which besides the drone attacks targeting the Russian airfields, which included blowing up railway tracks as well, continued into the evening yesterday. And when the Russian Defense Ministry reported that 53 drones had been shot down, at night the fragments of downed drones caused damage and fires in private and apartment buildings in the Kursk region. And the acting governor reported that the nighttime arrivals in Lipetsk, Voronezh, and Ryazan regions is circulating. He said the Russian armed forces carried out strikes with missile weapons and geraniums on targets in the Kharkov and Kirganov regions, as well as in part of the DPR occupied by the AFCU. So an hour later, the Two Majors published a statement from the Russian Defense Ministry reporting Russian air defenses had shot down 162 Ukrainian drones including 57 over the Kursk region, 31 over Belgorod, and smaller numbers over 7 other regions. Now, Zelensky, Ukraine's acting president, station only? Yeah, I got a text here I don't understand. Hold on just a second. No, I'm not sure of that. Anyway, Ukraine's acting president, Zelensky, called Operation Spiderweb a brilliant operation, which was aimed exclusively at military targets, specifically the equipment used in strikes against the Ukraine. During his night, he gives a speech every night. During last night's speech, he said this: the preparation took over a year and a half. Planning, organization, every detail was perfectly executed. I can say with certainty that this is an absolutely unique operation. What's most interesting, and this can now be stated publicly, is that the office of our operation on Russian territory was located directly next to FSB headquarters in one of their regions. In total, 117 drones were used in the operation, with a corresponding number of drone operators involved. 34% of the strategic cruise missile carriers stationed on air bases were hit. Our personnel operated across multiple Russian regions in 3 different time zones, and the people who assisted us were withdrawn from Russian territory before the operation, and they are now safe. A source in the SBU told Ukrainska Pravda that the operation, overseen by Zelensky and executed by SSU chief Vasily Malyuk, was logistically complex. The SSU first transported first-person view drones to Russia, then wooden mobile crates. On Russian territory, drones were concealed under the roofs of these crates mounted on lorries. At the designated time, the roofs were remotely opened, and the drones took off to strike Russian bombers. Now, Zelensky's claim of 34% of Russia's cruise missile carriers hit on target seems to be an exaggeration. Judging from the video evidence available on Russian Telegram channels, the actual losses seem to be in the range of maybe 5 to 9 aircraft, including as many as 4 Tu-95 Bear bombers, which they don't make anymore, mind you. Not the 41 bombers of the Ukrainians claiming, but still not insignificant. The destruction of our nuclear weapons carriers is an attack on Russia's strategic defense and an attempt to reduce our nuclear power, said the 2 majors. Kyiv must be destroyed as a demonstration. Now, the 2 majors don't speak for the Russian Federation, nor for Putin. But they're an interesting, you can get English translations. Very interesting source of information on the inside. But this is how they finished their comment. Kyiv must be destroyed as a demonstration. Now, if I had family in Kyiv, I would have told them a long time ago to get the hell out of there. If I had friends or relatives there now, I would tell them to get the hell out of there. Now, we know that the Oreshnik missile is incredibly accurate. And we also know that to date, the Russian attacks on Ukrainian homeland have involved data centers, power transmission zones, transportation centers, and military targets. They don't target the citizens. Putin was very clear on that. We're not going to target that. That's not our goal, as the Ukrainians have been against the Russians. So, I wanted to mention that and make that clear. Now, if you are listening by way of K-Talk Radio at AM 1640, we're back on here for the second hour. I've just been talking about Zelensky's comments regarding the drone strikes. And one of my sources of information, the two majors at X, and how they are now claiming that Kyiv must be destroyed as an answer to an attack on the strategic arm of the Russian military. I mean, it's one thing to shoot armored personnel vehicles. It's another thing to try to take out 155 millimeter artillery guns. But it's another thing when you start attacking nuclear strategic armed forces in the way of the Tu-95, the big bear bomber, that big gigantic bomber, which the Russians don't make anymore anyway. They've got more sophisticated, longer range fighting jets that are much more effective. But the Tu-95 was the equivalent of the B-52. So I saw a young lady last night who I've been taking care of for seizures, and in combination with a low-fat, keto-oriented diet and the spinal correction, she hasn't had any episodes for some time now. And I've talked to many patients. They'll call in. I said, well, we hear that you are able to help with seizures. Well, yeah, we are able to help with seizures. Seizures is a neurological event. It's like a wildfire going on inside the brain. Why? Why are all these synapses taking place that shouldn't be taking place? Well, there are some neuroscientists who claim it's a cleansing of toxic buildup of certain synaptic centers inside the brain, and that's why a lot of people, after a seizure is over with, come out more clear-headed. I don't know that it's worth the trade-off, but they say that they're much more clear-headed. However, that's not the way you want to live your life, with your brain doing a reset every 2 or 3 or 4 days, or 2 or 3 times a day. So in cooperation or in coordination with a low-fat keto-type diet, and you could start with the Mediterranean diet for that matter, but a good keto diet, and getting the structural interference removed from the bottom end of the brainstem that the upper cervical misalignment creates, we've been able to help many people, even adults with seizure activity, to see a great reduction, not just in the number of episodes, but the frequency and the intensity. And right along with that is the tremendous effect this has on migraines. I don't know if you've ever had migraines. I had them earlier in my life. They started after my experience with high school football and went on until I was 39 years old when I first came under this care. Just killer headache, migraine, at least once a week. It would just absolutely put me down. It would take anywhere from 6, 7, 8, 9 extra strength Excedrin to even begin to touch the pain. And I would often be on the floor with a cold pack across my forehead or on my neck at the base of my skull. By the time I would wake up the following morning, it would be over with. But I suffered with that for 20 years until I came under this care. And I can't remember the last time I even had a little headache. I've had some tight neck muscles when I'd lose my correction, but as far as the headache, the type of headaches I used to have. And so I've got some people I'm working with now who've experienced great reduction, if not altogether the elimination of their migraine headache pain, simply by a very gentle correction at the base of the skull, resetting the top segment back into its proper position relative to the neck and the skull itself. Very gentle, no twisting or pulling or high velocity type moves. Just a very, very gentle touch. It's like I tell my patients, if you put a drawer back into a cabinet exactly opposite the way it came out of the cabinet, it doesn't take much effort to put it where it belongs. So it's a matter of supporting the shoulder and the head in a balanced position, the muscles of the neck relax, and a very gentle contact of 1 to 2 ounces. You hardly know that I'm there. You wonder if I'm even doing anything. You start hearing some little tiny clicking sounds. But when you stand up, you know something's happened. You feel an immediate change in your structural alignment. And that's the work we do, and it's just part of what I am. And I was asked 3 times yesterday by 3 different patients, "You're not planning on retiring, are you?" No, it's too much fun. It's too much fun. Besides living my life as I want to live it, taking care of people, and doing these radio shows, that pretty well takes up my life, and I'm a very happy fellow. Now, it doesn't cost anything to come in and sit down and talk. If I think that your problem is outside my scope of practice, I'll tell you, and I'll give you some referrals. But if it's something I think I can help, I'll explain why and how and what you can expect. All at no charge to you. There's no charge unless you want me to take care of you. So I just wanted to say that. So whether we're talking about headache, migraine patterns, low back pain, sciatica, they're all caused by the same thing. The way the head is sitting on top of the neck. And when the head's out of balance with the neck, you're going to have problems all the way down to your plantar tendon in the bottom of your feet as the whole body's center of gravity comes off center. And then the body does the best it can to compensate against the forces of gravity with a collapsing structure. And if it isn't fixed, you're going to end up bent over, crouching, slouching, and with an ongoing appearance of one symptom after another. It's very effective. We have people coming in from out of state all the time for this kind of care. All right, now I want to get back into the program. Oh, you would call the office, 801-523-1890. 801-523-1890 to make an appointment for a consultation. And then, as I said, there's no charge unless you want me to take care of you, which is my living, mind you. All right, now, Gilbert Doctorow, who is a political analyst, he's a regular on the Napolitano podcast. In his analysis of this weekend offensive allegedly waged by Ukraine against Russia, he's suggesting that the incessant demand for long-range missiles from the West has as its ultimate goal drawing NATO countries into war with Russia. And the relevant section of his Sunday Post begins by discussing the larger role now assumed by drones in the war, especially since the medium-range missiles deployed to Ukraine so far have had actually minimal impact. So emphasizing the growing role of drones, he writes that more to the point, it indicates that the entire confrontation between Moscow and Berlin and Paris and London and Washington over the delivery of these long-range missiles to the Ukraine has been an artificial confrontation whipped up by the Ukraine, which has bleeded for missiles for most of the past 3 years. He said, the U.S.-made HIMARS were very quickly countered by Russian technical solutions. The vaunted British and French Storm Shadows have only been a minor nuisance to Russia, which found ways to bring them down and, most importantly, found ways to destroy or scare away their delivery means, namely the F-16s and specially adapted Ukrainian jets from the Soviet period. In his writing, he said, Kyiv has insisted on the utility, nay, on the absolute necessity of possessing these missiles, only for the sake of fomenting war between Russia and Britain, France, and now Germany with its Taurus. Then he concluded his post by pointing to the importance of confirming, quote, who provided the Ukrainians with the drones that they have used in Operation Spiderweb attack this weekend on Russian air bases. Perhaps they're the Ukraine's own drones, but perhaps they were supplied by the West. So when the Russian defenses shoot down these drones, or they examine the remains of the exploding devices when the drone hits its target, you can see if there's not immediate incineration of every piece involved. And if there's any metal, there's going to be metal pieces left. They do have certain kinds of missiles that are cellulose wrapped, cellulose explosives as well as paper. They're very tough, resilient cardboard type of material that makes up the body of the missile. Air to ground, not the Hellfire, but things like that, so that when they explode, the missile, the delivery system is consumed in the blast. But most of these drones are either fiberglass or metallic or have metallic parts. So when they recover the debris from these exploding drones, they can tell where they come from. Now, were they drones that were delivered by the United States that the Ukrainian people sold on the black market to South African nations, who then turned around, marked them up 300% and sold them back as part of the money laundering operation that's been going on since it started? Well, it's difficult to tell, but they're going to find out. Just as, you know, anytime a nuclear explosion takes place, which doesn't happen very often, thank goodness, and they are able to sweep the ground, and by picking up the radioactive debris, they know where it came from. Just like when Chernobyl blew up. Do you remember who the first people were to know that there had been a meltdown of Chernobyl before the Russians came out and admitted it? Do you remember what nation knew about it first? Or at least the first nation to say something publicly? It was Sweden. Because Sweden was picking up in their air radioactive debris. Now, this was, you know, several days to a few weeks later. But the clockwise movement of air through northern Europe would pick this stuff at Chernobyl and deliver it to the Scandinavian nations. And it was Sweden that did, and they could tell by the various methods of detection that they have, they could tell where that came from. By the makeup of the radioactive isotopes and whatever else were present in the dust of the debris, they could tell that it came from Chernobyl. So they got on the phone to Russia. What the hell's going on over there? Well, Chernobyl's in the Ukraine, but it was Russia at the time. What the hell's the matter with you people? All right. I have, for some time since this thing began in April of 2022, and even prior to that, I had some radio shows that weren't completely dominated by COVID, talked about the neo-Nazi presence in the Ukraine and the Banderites that were followers of Stepan Bandera, who, according to certain sources, was responsible for at least 1 million Jew deaths himself, of the Jews, of the gypsies, of the homosexuals, of all the rest of the people that they were trying to clean out to preserve the purity of their race or whatever reason. There's a lot of Banderites in the Ukraine, and they're absolutely violently anti-Russian, as the Nazis were during World War II. So in an unusual report that breaks with the Western narrative, that the Ukrainian forces are all democratic freedom fighters, William Parker, who's an expert at the British Royal United Services Institute, admits the presence of a significant number of fighters with Nazi views in the ranks of the armed forces of the Ukraine. Oh, interrupted there. So in a recent paper that was titled "Destruction from Within, the Dangers of Peace for the Ukraine," he argues that the war is not only a contest between two armies, it's a test of the internal stability of the Ukrainian state itself. And he warns that with a cessation of hostilities could lead to the collapse of an unstable coalition now governing the Ukraine. He said that this war must continue to prevent the development of a bloody civil war and to eliminate radical groups within the Ukraine. Because if this war were to end, and other experts have talked about this, there would be massive civil war inside of Ukraine between the pro-Nazis and the anti-Nazis in the Ukrainian government. But I thought it was just kind of interesting that they finally came out and admitted it, because you don't see admissions like that very much. Now I want to jump down to the Middle East. I've got some other things I want to talk about regarding the Ukraine and what's going on there. But while most of the world's attention is focused on these renewed atrocities imposed by the Netanyahu regime on the population of Gaza, Haaretz columnist Amir Taibon says that the greater Israeli fanatics are moving rapidly to annex more of the West Bank in order to permanently preclude the possibility of a Palestinian state. So he reports this week, quote, "Short of a formal annexation declaration, the government is doing everything possible to signal that it intends to absorb this territory, home to more than 2 million Palestinians, into the state of Israel. That includes the announcement of 22 new settlements, the effort to legalize isolated outposts that are illegal even under Israeli law, and the expansion of roads that cut through the West Bank and entrench Israeli control." The quote continues, "These moves are happening in parallel and are all part of a larger unified strategy." Well, the strategy was famously pronounced by former Prime Minister Sharon as the establishing facts on the ground, he said. The facts are what we make them as we establish more and more control of the ground and creating permanent impediments to the formation of a Palestinian state. Now remember, the West Bank, Israel proper and the West Bank are east of the Jordan River, or west of the Jordan River. The West Bank is an area that belongs to Palestine that is on the western side of the Jordan River, coming out of the Sea of Galilee, going down to the Dead Sea. Now, if you were standing on the western edge side of the Jordan River, looking to the west, you'd be looking at the West Bank. And if you were to march directly west, you would cover through the narrow section of the West Bank, which is, for the most part, about as wide as Israel is, until you got to the border between the West Bank and Israel. This was all partitioned back in 1948 when the United Nations finally agreed to the partitioning of Israel and Palestine into the two separate areas. Well, without going through all the history of what's happened since then, and it's just as stupidly deadly and bloody as what's happened in the last 3 years in the Ukraine, the Palestinians have, in the area of the West Bank, various cities. Most of the cities of the story of the New Testament are in the West Bank. You know, even Jerusalem, if I remember correctly. I might be wrong on that, but I think so. But what the Israeli government has been doing, and nobody has done anything to stop them except Hamas has tried to, the PLA has tried to. Israel is slowly annexing one piece after another of the West Bank and trying to make it Israel proper. And so there's a lot of fighting that's gone on there. Now, what Israel has done is to announce 22 new settlements in an effort to legalize these isolated outposts that are illegal even under Israeli law, and the expansion of roads that cut through the West Bank to further entrench Israeli control so that they can get their APCs and their tanks and their military vehicles and everything else further into the West Bank, because the more of the West Bank they take over, the less land there is to actually designate a Palestinian state. Now, Taibon, in his Haaretz article, says that the decision to deny entry to Arab foreign ministers into Israel this last week is part of the strategy. The Israeli government canceled the plans of foreign ministers of Saudi Arabia, Egypt, Jordan, United Arab Emirates to visit Ramallah and to meet with representatives of the Palestinian Authority. And the implication that this not only adds to the isolation of the Palestinian Authority, but it's a backhand slap from Netanyahu against Trump's Abraham Accords for normalization of relations between Israel and the so-called moderate Arab states, as these countries have been the most open to Trump's initiative. So Haaretz reported last week that annexation has been increasingly part of Netanyahu's post-Gaza war plan, and this is coming not only from extremist advocates of expansion such as Ben Gvir and Smotrich, who demand that the occupied territories be made permanently part of Israel, but from some of the moderate centrists as well. So there was a report on speeches favoring annexation of the West Bank lands by Benny Gantz, President Isaac Herzog, at a rally of settlers in the West Bank. And both Gantz and Herzog are identified as moderates, but they were in lockstep on annexation with the most violent settler groups. And they argued in favor of annexation as a means of making Israel more secure. So the article reported that such annexation is not only a violation of international law, but it's also a violation of Israeli law. And the madness just goes on and on and on. You know, it's the age-old give them an inch and they'll take a mile kind of thing. When there's no resistance to the power of this juggernaut under control of Netanyahu and Smotrich and Ben Gvir, nobody's stopping him. Trump's not stopping him. And they take another piece of property after another piece of property of another piece of property. Claiming that it's God's will that they establish the true authority of the Israeli people under promises made in the Old Testament that this land is our land. But what they don't quote from Solomon is that it's the land of God's chosen people, so-called the Jews, only if they take care of everybody and they take care of their neighbors and they prosper the life and welfare of everyone in the area, then it's their land. Not when they shoot children in the head with sniper rifles. All right. Now, someone was asking me a question the other day about, you know, a lot of multi-generational Utahns. And by multi-generational, I mean that have been here since the 1800s. I'm a first-generation Utahn. I consider myself a Utahn. Born and raised back east. Came to Utah at 17 to go to BYU as a freshman. And I've lived in Arizona, I've lived in Texas, I've lived in Iowa, and a few different places back east, which I loved. But Utah's my home, and I consider myself a Utahn. But I have patients who are multi-generational, and many of them can trace their roots to the Utah pioneers. And every now and then, there are members of these families that have an unusually high level of cancer. And because this is kind of a political thing, I thought I would mention it today rather than tomorrow. That they feel like they're victims of the Nevada test site. And that prior to the nuclear testing that was going on in Nevada, where there are several states that are downwind, and the winds have carried that debris over the entire country, not just Utah, Nevada, Colorado, Idaho, Wyoming, but the entire country. Between 1951 and 1962, let's see, 1951, I wasn't even a year old yet. 62, I was fluctuating between 11 and 12. In that 11-year period, do you know how many nuclear bombs were detonated at the Nevada Test Center? Now, those of you who fall in the group that I was describing here at the beginning of this, you know how many. But if you're not familiar with it, more than 100 nuclear bombs were exploded in open air, not underground stuff, above ground, at the Nevada test site and elsewhere, releasing radioactive fallout into the skies that, as some misbehaving little children, that fallout didn't respect state lines. They weren't territorial. They just went wherever the wind blew. And among the most dangerous byproducts is something called iodine-131. It's a radioactive isotope that seeks out, not stealthily, it's very easy to trace it, and embeds itself in the human thyroid gland, especially in children. And the winds carry this fallout far and wide. From Nevada to New York, from Montana to Mississippi, every corner of the continental United States was blanketed by this fallout. It was not a localized tragedy to people born and raised in St. George. It was a national exposure event. And ironically, doctors today intentionally use iodine-131 to treat patients with certain thyroid conditions, including hyperthyroidism and differentiated thyroid cancer. Now, what is iodine-131? Why is it so dangerous? Well, unlike background radiation, and there's background radiation coming out of the earth, there's background radiation coming from our sun, there's background radiation coming from the cosmic center of the Milky Way galaxy, at which now they've located a black hole. If you're anywhere near volcanic rock, there's more background radiation. And but unlike background radiation, iodine-131 is man-made. It's a high-risk isotope. An isotope is like an isotope of iodine, has iodine at its core, but its electron configuration is a little bit different, but it's still iodine. And it works a little different, especially when it's radioactive. And it starts throwing off gamma particles. Now, once released into the environment, iodine-131 contaminates the grass, the cows eat the grass, and then the children drink the milk. It doesn't take much. And the thyroid is highly sensitive to radioactive iodine, and exposure during childhood dramatically increases the risk of thyroid cancer, autoimmune thyroid disease, and other endocrine dysfunctions. Now, the National Cancer Institute and the National Research Council have both acknowledged this. And their modeling estimates that nearly every American alive during the testing years was exposed to iodine-131 from fallout without warning, without consent. Just like many other little surreptitious behaviors on the part of the government, you are subjected to certain kinds of testing without you ever knowing about it. The Tuskegee Airmen was bad enough. And so the National Cancer Institute said people living in the United States at that time of the testing were exposed to varying levels of radiation. So where did the fallout go? Well, the high fallout zones, because once this dust blows up into the atmosphere, a lot of it, electrostatic charges will just carry it like dust. Other heavier pieces will become affected by gravity and come back down to the earth. And so the high fallout zones were Utah, Idaho, Montana, Colorado, and Nevada. And the states downwind of the Nevada test site were the most saturated. Now, the Midwest, the Northeast, the Southeast all received measurable doses. The rainfall during these fallout events drove the radioactive particles into crops, into water supplies, into food chains across the nation. Even Hawaii saw measurable fallout from the Pacific tests that were taking place. So the National Cancer Institute released maps showing iodine-131 exposure estimates down to county levels. And Princeton's program on Science and Global Security published research detailing the spread of radioactive fallout from nearly 100 continental U.S. atmospheric nuclear weapon tests. And these maps, and if you Google Princeton's program on Science and Global Security, Princeton's program on Science and Global Security, you can see these maps. These maps make one thing clear. Everybody in America was exposed at one time or another. And the U.S. government did not inform the public in real time. So, in fact, decades passed before the extent of exposure was ever acknowledged. And by the time the compensation programs were created in the 1990s, through the Radiation Exposure Compensation Act, the damage is already done. As of 2014, nearly 30,000 claims have been paid to Americans harmed by fallout from the tests. But even those numbers undercount the full toll, of course. Record keeping from that test area was very incomplete. Dose reconstructions are just educated guesses. But many, many cases of thyroid cancer and autoimmune illnesses may never be picked up and connected to that fallout because the system wasn't designed to track them. So the bottom line, the U.S. government detonated nuclear bombs above ground that released iodine-131 into the air. The wind and weather patterns spread that fallout across every state in the Union. Children who drank contaminated milk or played outside during peak fallout were especially vulnerable. And the federal government has quietly acknowledged that exposure, but only after lawsuits, investigative pressure, and scientific modeling made denial impossible. And this wasn't some foreign actor. This was our government, exposing its people to radioactive material without disclosure, consent, or adequate warning. And they knew when these things exploded how dangerous they were. So if you're an American born before 1972, odds are you have ingested radioactive iodine, courtesy of the United States government. So the real question isn't whether the government has exposed U.S. citizens to deadly substances without telling us, but what substances are they exposing us today without telling us? What's in those damn chemtrails? And you're not going to get an honest word from your government. Now, I'm a pilot, and I know the difference between a contrail and a chemtrail. And I will have people call me, call the office, tell Dr. Jack to look up at the sky, or tell Jack to look at the sky. And I can tell whether it's a contrail or a chemtrail. Mostly it's a contrail, because when you have high pressure, there's not very much wind up there. And if the plane is high enough, 38,000 feet or higher, it's going to leave a contrail. And the major byproduct that comes out of burning kerosene, jet fuel that's in these commercial airplanes or jets, is water. And that water shooting out the back end of that engine in the form of extremely high temperature steam hits that cold air and condenses and forms water vapor. And when you watch those things in a high pressure type period like we're having right now, no, it's changing. That's why we got this cold spell that came through. You're not going to see a lot of those contrails hanging around. Now with chemtrails, if you look at them with binoculars, you'll see the oil, the solvent, the things that alter the color so that it looks like, you know, not so much like a prism gathering the light spectrum against the wall, but something similar to that. I just wanted to say that. There's an awful lot of times people say, tell Jack to go look at the sky, and it's contrails. Now, if I wasn't a pilot and didn't have training in meteorology, I might not know that. But when it's chemtrails, it's obvious. It's very obvious because there's a different color to it. All right. What do we have? About 15 minutes left. So, what is going to be Russia's retaliation to these drone strikes? Several bases, as you know, all across Russia were involved. And I was, somebody asked me to talk about the Golden Dome. I started to get into that and why it's crazy, why it's financially impossible. I have a lot of notes on that, but I don't think I want to do that. There's only a few minutes left in today's program. I think I'm going to pass over that. There is something I want to go back and address that President Trump said. Regarding the 80th anniversary celebration that took place last month with the defeat of the European Axis powers. There's this notorious non-issue that's still gaining some prominence. And I don't like it when my president of my country is, I understand that he doesn't think always before he says something. And just like me, probably just like you to some degree, you would like to go back and take back some of the things that you've said. But there's this, you know, it's which country deserves the most credit and had sacrificed the most to achieve victory over the Axis powers that was commemorated last month. And the mere raising of the preposterous question creates this artificial and, for poorly schooled citizens of Western countries, thoroughly misleading historical dilemma. I mean, in the most relevant sense, this non-issue was recently featured in a statement by President Trump, and it bears directly on the question of which country contributed the most to the victory of Allied forces and bore the brunt of that victory in terms of lives and treasures sacrificed on the altar of a common victory. And the position in this regard of the leading country of the collective West was unmistakably reflected in President Trump's decision to designate May 8, the 8th day of May, as Victory Day in the United States, coinciding with Victory in Europe Day, celebrated by most Europeans since Germany surrendered in May of 1945. And there's nothing necessarily controversial in the creation of this new holiday, except for the president's grandiloquent rationale in support of this new holiday, because, as he said, we did more than any other country by far in producing a victorious result. Now, I remember listening to clips on the national news that evening when he said that. And I just went, oh, Donald, please. I mean, there can be no dispute that alongside other Allied troops, the United States forces, and I can say this because I was raised by a man who was wounded in Europe in 1945, towards the end of the war. He ended up in Virginia for 6 months convalescence to recover from a serious chest wound that would have killed him had not a German woman protected him from German troops. My last name would be something else now besides Stockwell. And we've talked about that. But there's no argument that the other Allied troops, besides the U.S., fought bravely, sacrificially to defeat the Axis powers, not just in Europe, but in the Pacific, against Japan, where they achieved victory in August of 45. But to claim that the United States did more than any other country, and by far, as Trump said, to secure victory in World War II is just stretching it a bit. Now, President Trump is a patriotic American, but he's no historian anymore than he's completely conversant with academic economics. I was going to say something there about the tariffs, but I'm not. I mean, there's nothing inherently wrong or incorrect with celebrating America's enormous contribution to the Allied victory, or even hyping it, as long as it's done with a sense of proportion, with due respect for the sacrifices of others. And many nations, large and small, contributed to the victorious result of World War II, which saved the world from the horrors of fascism, at least in the form in which it had presented itself 80 years ago. Now, it would seem that being apparently better informed and closer to actual events, President Franklin Roosevelt had a much more realistic picture of the major participants relative to the victory of the contribution to the Allied victory. In one of his fireside chats in March of 1942, President Roosevelt said this, quote, "Russian troops have destroyed and continue to destroy more manpower, planes, tanks, and cannons of our common enemy than all the other United Nations combined." Roosevelt said that in April of 42. Now, or March of 42. What had already happened? Barbarossa had already happened. Stalingrad had happened. The German Wehrmacht had been broken on the Eastern Front. The only way D-Day could have successfully occurred 2 years later was the massive amount of German manpower that had been taken out of the Western theater and sent off to the East to fight against the Russians, who turned out to be a much more formidable foe than Hitler ever imagined, although his generals warned him of this. So throughout this conflict, Roosevelt spoke in much the same vein. In a letter to the Soviet government dated 4th of February 1943, Roosevelt offered his congratulations on the local, but in terms of the conflict dynamics, pivotal victory over the Axis in Stalingrad. And he said, by their example, Russian soldiers arose to the Allies aroused in the Allies a new determination to achieve the final defeat of the victory. And then a special announcement by the 32nd President of the United States, February 4th, 1943. Congratulations to Marshal Stalin on the Russian victory at Stalingrad. Later that month, President Roosevelt said, "The Red Army and the Russian people certainly forced Adolf Hitler's armed forces to follow the path to final defeat and won the admiration of the people of the United States for a long time." And then he said this, "By far the largest, most important developments in the whole worldwide strategic picture of 1942 were the events of the long fronts of Russia, first the implacable defense of Stalingrad, and second the offensive by the Russian armies at various points that started in the latter part of November, which still roll on with great force and effectiveness." Now, I think in all honesty, such sentiments, historically accurate as they might be, were probably Roosevelt being courteous, and contained tributes intended to fortify the links with a strategic ally, and encouraging Stalin and the Russians to fight even harder, I suspect. But there's just far too many hard data points, independent of these remarks, that pertain to the relative contributions of the participants in the conflict for the theory that Roosevelt's words were just courteous accolades to be sustainable. And one is that about 80% of the casualties inflicted on the Axis in the course of the entire war in Europe occurred on what they called the Eastern Front, in the context of Nazi Germany's ultimately unsuccessful invasion of Russia. And directly related to that fact, apart from the material devastation that was suffered by the USSR, the peoples comprising the Soviet Union suffered 27 million military and civilian casualties during World War II, dwarfing the losses of the European nations, Great Britain and the United States combined. And of equal significance, as I just said there a moment ago, for most of the war, about 75 to 80% of the Wehrmacht had been deployed to the east, which is in itself conclusive proof of where the German High Command perceived its principal opponent to be. And the 80% of German war dead who perished in combat against Russia were about 4 million to 5 million German soldiers killed in World War II. And this is objective data from the U.S. National War Museum. So the reason I want to mention this, in conjunction with several other articles written on this, is just the scandalous trend in the collective West's discourse regarding World War that ended 80 years ago. And it's a vicious campaign worthy of the knaves who run our Department of Defense to rewrite and maliciously misrepresent the history of World War II. And borrowing a key concept from the sick woke methodology, the consensus engineers of the collective West are even now attempting to cancel, to block out, to memory hold the significance of Russia's unique and indispensable role in defeating Nazi Germany and its Axis allies, and to denigrate the unparalleled magnitude of Russia's contribution to the war effort, whose fruits we still enjoy to this day, and to indecently mock the generous sacrifices made by the Russian people. This should not be allowed to succeed, these woke monsters in their despicable purpose to erase the Russian contribution to World War II. Had Stalin not been effective, even under the worst conditions of a communist nation, had he not been successive in destroying the Wehrmacht, I honestly believe all of Europe would be speaking German today. I really believe that. And I just wanted to get that off my chest because I get tired. Because when I hear the president say the United States did more than anybody else in producing, he said, we did more than any other country by far in producing a victorious result. commemorating the new national holiday, Victory Day, May 8th. And I know many of you are familiar with that. You know this. You know this as well as I do. All right, we're coming up towards an end here. I'm going to keep my ear tuned to my various news sources, because what happened this weekend at those 4 strategic nuclear Russian air bases is not just going to disappear in the night. Every time the West has done something against Russia of any military significance, Russia has come back with something far worse. And as I said, I have been praying regularly for Putin's patience to continue and to not fall into some knee-jerk reaction, but to think this through carefully before he responds. And he has to respond. You can't attack a nation's military strongholds, especially in the sense of nuclear air bases, and get away with it. And the 2 majors, their ex-podcast, are begging Putin to destroy Kyiv. Well, I don't know what's going to happen next, but the Russians can't just let that go by, because this kind of engenders the West to believe that they can actually defeat Russia in the Ukrainian theater when the war is essentially over anyway. Will Putin just go ahead and bring in nearly 1 million more soldiers and just take over all the rest that they want to take over, that's Russian, ethnic Russian controlled, or Russian population? Will he use the Oreshniks? Will he go after something outside of the Ukraine? I'll get to that Monday. All right, that is going to finish the broadcast at K-Talk. And for those of you listening on the stream, once again, I appreciate your audience being a part of the program. Thank you, Sammer. These are unprecedented times. Keep your wits about you. Don't have any knee-jerk reactions yourself when you see crazy stuff taking place. But this is a time to prepare. This is a time to be ready, because all hell could break out at any time. So I'll see you tomorrow on the Health Show. Thank you for being a part of the program today. And this is Jack Stockwell, Truth Without a Muzzle at Global Affairs.